Okay, so we are now recording, and it will be only the presentation that's recording. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, which is this little icon at the bottom corner. All right, so a land acknowledgement before we begin. The University of Waterloo is situated within the city of Waterloo, and this is located on the Haldimand Tract. This is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So my name is Alia, and I'm a lab assistant this term with the Ecology lab at the University of Waterloo. What the Ecology lab does is we support lab and field activities, courses, and outreach projects under the Faculty of Environment at this university. We are now open. We were closed for some time during the pandemic, but we are now operational, and you're welcome to contact us if you'd like to loan equipment or use the lab for your research. All right, so today we're going to cover a few topics. We'll quickly go over insect evolution. So this is to help determine what the difference is between insects and other related taxa or groups of organisms. We're also going to cover some basic adult insect anatomy and some common terrestrial insect orders. So these are some common groupings of insects which can be identified based on certain features. We'll also go over how to use the dichotomous key. So if you ever need to use an ID guide to be able to identify an insect family or beyond, we'll be going over that together, as well as some resources besides dichotomous keys that you can look into to help identify insects a little better. All right, so here is our insect evolutionary tree. It's a little big with a lot of terminology, but the ones that I want you to focus on are circled in red here. So insects fall under insecta over here. I'm just putting my mouse on there. And if you follow them backwards, you'll find that insects and crustaceans at some point were very closely related. All of these organisms fall within the phylum Arthropoda. So arthropods includes insects, crustaceans like your crabs and your lobsters, myriapods over here like your centipedes and your millipedes, which are again separate from insects. You'll see that they evolved a little separately, as well as spiders and ticks. These fall under Chalcid, and these evolved, they branched off quite early in this evolutionary tree. Does anyone have any questions about where insects sort of evolved from based on this tree? And if you do, you're welcome to enter them to the chat. Okay, awesome. We're going to follow four groupings of insects in particular, and these are because they're just so diverse compared to all these other insect orders. And that's because they sort of co-evolved along with flowering plants. So these are the four orders that you'll typically see around plants, and they're really important pollinators. And those are going to be our beetles, our flies, our butterflies and moths, and our bees and wasps, which we'll be covering last. If you take a look at all the eukaryote species, so these are typically your multicellular species with some caveats, you'll find that almost half of these species that have been described are insects. The other half include plants and other animals and fungi. But insects really make up a huge portion of this eukaryote diversity. And out of these insects, all of these that are sort of squared in red are beetles. So there are a lot of beetles that have been described over the last couple of centuries. A couple hundred years ago, some scientists, for some reason, decided they really liked beetles, and so there have been a lot of people going out and studying beetles, but based on the ecological functions that we know of flies and wasps as well, it's sort of assumed that flies and wasps also have a significant amount of diversity. So these percentages may go up as we discover more flies and wasps. All right, so all insects fall under the kingdom Animalia, so they're all animals. And as we discussed earlier, they're all arthropods, and they all fall under the class Insecta. Today we'll be going over how to cover 6 different orders, so how to identify which order they belong to, and some families that are within those orders. Does anyone have any questions about the arrangement taxonomically of insects? Okay. Awesome. And if you ever have a question at any point, feel free to just shoot it into the chat and I'll get back to it when I can, or when I see it. All right, so some basic insect anatomy. All insects have 3 bodily segments. These are the head. That's going to contain most of the insect's sensory body parts. The thorax, this will contain its legs and its wings. And the abdomen, this contains all of its vital organs. All insects also have 6 legs, so if you see an individual with more or less than 6 legs, like a millipede for example, it's not going to be an insect. Insects can also be differentiated based on their wing types. So we have membranous wings over here. You'll notice that these have some really interesting vein patterns. Wing venation can be used to determine which order or family an insect might belong to, so keep an eye on these wing venation patterns as we move along in this webinar. There's also scaled wings. Now these are typically specific to butterflies and moths. We'll take a closer look at how these wings are scaled in a little bit, but scales are really great at reflecting light very well, and that's where you get all those really colorful butterflies and moths from. There's also these insects. These are our grasshoppers and crickets, and they typically have leathery forewings and membranous hindwings. So again, with these membranous wings, you'll see some really interesting venation in the hindwings, but the forewings are a little more leathery. They're kind of hardened, like a hard parchment paper. And then here, in the case of beetles, you'll have completely hardened forewings and membranous hindwings. So again, those hindwings with that membranous venation. And then forewings are completely hard. They can't even be used for flight in this instance. All right, some more terminology. These are a lot of terms, but there are a few specific terms I'd like for you to focus on. First of all, does anyone know what kind of insect this might be? Feel free to just type it in the chat. Okay, grasshopper? Yeah, so this is a grasshopper. So all grasshoppers, and their closely related kin, crickets, they fall under the first order that we're going to cover, and that's Orthoptera. Here are some important anatomical terms that we should be able to familiarize ourselves with. So the eyes. Eyes are really important in determining what kind of order or family an insect might belong to. The antenna, so different insects will have different kinds of antenna, and we'll be going into this. The pronotum, so this is a little shield-like kind of body part that covers the thorax, and sometimes the size and shape of the pronotum can give you an idea of what kind of insect it is. You'll notice that this grasshopper has its forewing and its hindwing. All orthopterans, so those are grasshoppers and crickets, as I mentioned earlier, have those leathery forewings. And then membranous hindwings. Almost all insects will have 2 pairs of wings, so they'll have 2 forewings and 2 hindwings. There are a few exceptions, and we'll be going into those as well. And the last body part you want to look at is the tarsus. So down at the feet, you'll find that the feet are sort of separated into these segments that we call tarsal segments, or tarsi. And tarsi can also, based on the number of segments and the shape of those segments, can give you an idea of what kind of insect it is. Does anyone have any questions about insect anatomy and grasshopper or orthopteran anatomy? Okay, awesome. All right, so within Orthoptera, there are usually 4 big subgroupings that you want to focus on. We have our grasshoppers, our crickets, our katydids, and our mole crickets. We're not going to focus on mole crickets too much. They're a little weird looking. But one thing that you want to notice is that all grasshoppers and crickets and katydids under Orthoptera have these enlarged hind legs, and that's the first feature you want to look for to tell whether it's an orthopteran or not. This neat diagram kind of shows you what the size and shape of the pronotum is, and that can sort of help you determine whether it's a grasshopper, a katydid, or a cricket. I personally find that like an easier way to figure out the difference between a grasshopper and a cricket is that crickets just have way longer antennae. So if you see something like an Orthoptera with a short antenna, it's probably a grasshopper. And if it has really, really long antenna, it's probably going to be a cricket or a katydid. Katydids are like kind of weird looking grasshoppers. They have long antenna and they're kind of flattened looking. We're going to take a look at them in a little bit. But for now, that's Orthoptera and the 4 or 3 main subgroupings that you want to be focusing on. Anyone have any questions about grasshoppers and the difference between grasshoppers and crickets? Yes, Michael, you've got a question? Yeah, so, I actually don't know. That's a good question. I would want to look that up too. Yeah, I don't know much about mole crickets, unfortunately. But that is a good question. Thank you. All right. Moving on to our next order. So this is order Coleoptera, and that is the beetles. All beetles, again, have this hardened forewing that's called a sclerotized forewing. And that's why only the hind wing is used for flight. You'll see when ladybugs sort of lift off and they start to fly, which, by the way, ladybugs are beetles, and we'll take a look at them in a second. You'll notice that they're kind of using their hind wings for flight, and their forewings are just sort of lifted up in the air to let their hind wings move around. One way of identifying a beetle is that when these wings are closed, so in the bottom left corner you'll see these little scarab beetles, you'll notice that they form a straight line down the back because they're coming together sort of side by side. Beetles also have chewing mouth parts called mandibles, which we'll see in a little second, but that's another way to tell apart beetles from other insects. And as we know, they constitute 25% of all known life forms, just because there's so many beetles out there and so many people who are interested in learning about beetles. Sorry, question from Diana, are each of the Orthopterans families crickets, grasshoppers? No, so those are actually suborders, so we didn't go to family there, but we will in a little bit. Towards the end, we're going to start using a dichotomous key and get to families under Orthoptera. All right. So these are our beetles. Some common beetle families, leaf beetles here on the left and lady beetles on the right. You'll notice that they look very different. The difference between leaf beetles and lady beetles lies in their feet. So remember back to our first anatomy picture that we saw these little tarsi or tarsomeres, the segments of the feet. Leaf beetles have 5 segments and lady beetles have 4 segments. And it's very specific, but that's how you tell apart leaf beetles from lady beetles. And you'll notice in leaf beetles as well, you can see that little straight line down the back. Lady beetles also typically have shorter antennae, which are clubbed, unlike leaf beetles. Another family that you might see around are scarab beetles. These, again, you want to take a look at those, that line down the back from those hardened elytra. And I've pulled this description right from the field guide that we're going to be using called Marshall's. And it notes that the lamellae of the antennal club can be closed. So that's a lot of terminology. Lamellae are just these little furry things that you see kind of sticking out of the antenna, and they can be closed. And that's how you sometimes tell them apart from other similar looking families. All right, any questions about beetles? Do leaf beetles bite? I actually don't know if leaf beetles bite. That is a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. 25% of all known insects or life forms. It's 25% of all known eukaryotic organisms, so all known eukaryotic life forms. And a question about the forewings? Yes, the forewings are used for protection. Okay. So we're going to move on to our next order. So those are our beetles, and these are what we call true bugs. Typically when people say the word bug, it's usually in reference to all insects, plus some other things like spiders, millipedes, crabs. When an entomologist refers to the term bug, they're really talking about these insects that fall within the order Hemiptera. So bugs look very, very similar to beetles, but the main difference is that, first of all, they have this little rostrum, which is kind of like a needle-like beak, whereas, again, beetles have those chewing mandibles. And their wings as well. You'll notice that the forewing here isn't fully hardened. You can kind of see some membrane towards the back of this bug's body. And in fact, some bugs also have fully membranous wings. And these wings also overlap over one another. So you see this big triangular piece on the thorax. That's called the scutellum, and it's right behind this pronotum that we were talking about earlier. So again, two things that separate bugs from beetles is, one is this rostrum, this needle-like rostrum, and two, these wings that are semi-hardened or sometimes not at all hardened, and they overlap, which form a really obvious sort of triangle known as a scutellum. All right, so we're going to do a quick quiz. Is this a bug or a beetle? Beetle, beetle, okay. Everyone says beetle, all right. And what is it that made you think this is a beetle and not a bug? Mandibles, mandibles, hard outer wings. Awesome, yeah, so this beetle has giant mandibles, and it has these hardened outer wings that form this lateral line down its back. It does have a little triangle, but in bugs it's typically a lot more obvious because of the way the wings overlap. All right, how about this one? Is this a bug or a beetle? Bug, 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 all right. Awesome. Awesome, wings overlap with V. Yeah, so again, it's got these overlapping wings. There's that little V or little triangle called the scutellum. And you'll notice there's some membrane towards the back of its wings. And if you take a close look at its head, you'll also notice that it's got a little piercing mouth part. A little hard to tell from this image, but those definitely are not mandibles. This is a plant bug, by the way, if anyone's interested. And we're going to be talking about plant bugs in a little bit. All right, how about this? This is a bug or a beetle? Beetle, beetle, beetle. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so this is a beetle. And you can tell, again, by these chewing mouth parts called mandibles. And this is a bit of a trick because you can see most of this insect's abdomen here. Its hardened wings are really, really short. These are rove beetles. They're among the most described taxa in the world, so there are a lot of rove beetles out there. And they have a really interesting way of folding their wings. When they fold them in, they kind of do it origami style and pack them under these hardened forewings, which are really, really short. So you see a big chunk of their abdomen, and their hind wings are kind of tucked underneath their forewings. It's really neat. All right, so some common bug families that you might see. Here's a stink bug. Stink bugs fall under family Pentatomidae, sorry. And they have a really, really obvious scutellum, and they're typically what you think of when you think of like a true bug. Good question, Diana. Is a mosquito a bug or a completely different order? We're going to be talking about mosquitoes in a little bit. They do fall under a different order, so hang on to that question. All right. Here on the right-hand side are what we call shield-back bugs. So this is just an example of bugs that don't necessarily look entirely like bugs. If we took a closer look at this, we'd notice that there is some membrane towards the back, but you can't really see the triangle as well, and that's because the pronotum is kind of covering that triangle. It sort of covers much of its thorax, but if we took a look at its mouth parts, we'd notice that it does have that rostrum, and that's how we differentiate it from beetles. All right, some more families. So these do not again, look like true bugs at all, and you might take a look at this and be like, oh my gosh, I can't tell if this is a bug or like what it is because I don't see any triangle, I don't see that overlapping wing shape. But again, if you look at the mouth part, you'll notice that it has that sort of needle-like beak. And it's going to be a little different from mosquitoes and other insects that we're going to talk about in a little bit. These are really interesting. They're leafhoppers and froghoppers. And the way you tell apart a leafhopper from a froghopper is that the tibia, so again, its little foot parts are either going to be kind of spiny, so like little spines, or fringed at the end. So they have like these little, sort of like spines, but like these little frayed ends sort of sticking out at the end. And froghoppers are really cool because they can jump higher in relation to their body size than any other animal in the world. So these are like a personal favorite of mine. I love seeing them. And I've had a few jump at my face, which is never fun, but still interesting. All right, a last family of bugs. Another one, again, that doesn't quite look like bugs, and this is because its wings are fully membranous. So I mentioned that a few bugs will have fully membranous wings, and cicadas fall under that category. But again, if you looked at its mouth part, you'd see that little beak-like rostrum at the front. How you tell apart cicadas from other families, if you were going through a dichotomous key, is that it would probably say that the antennae are not separated from the head by this ridge. And we'll look into that in more detail once we hit the dichotomous key. But cicadas are really cool because they have among the loudest calls proportionate to their body size, and if you live in North America, you'll hear them every year. The picture of the froghopper, yes, sorry, my bad. So the one on the left here is a leafhopper, and the one on the right is the froghopper. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to our next order. These are flies, true flies. They fall within the order Diptera. All flies have a single pair of wings, so we are talking about all insects having two pairs of wings. Dipterans are going to be our exception. They only have one pair of wings, and the hind wings are reduced to these little knobs called halters or halteres. True flies are really, really difficult to ID. Really hard to ID I personally find them difficult to ID using a dichotomous key to families sometimes, and they're almost impossible to identify to species just because the features are so small, and flies can also be very, very small, but this order does include mosquitoes, your house flies, bee flies, and others. Some body parts that you want to take a look at for these are the proboscis. So you'll notice that the proboscis is kind of similar looking to that of the true bugs that we were talking about, but it's typically a bit longer and more obvious, and it protrudes a little bit better. Flies also have these big compound eyes that take up much of their head most of the time. Sometimes they don't, and again, there's a lot of diversity in true flies, and they can get really difficult to ID. But yeah, these are two body parts that you want to take a look at, as well as the single pair of wings. Those are going to be your dead giveaway. Some common families, I'm not really going to go over how exactly to ID them, because again, they can be really difficult to ID. But mosquitoes, there's a good chance if it's drinking your blood, it's probably going to fall under this family. Adults drink nectar, but females with eggs are going to be drinking blood. And we know them for the huge cultural, health, and economic significance that they have in our communities. Houseflies as well, they fall under a really, really big family, but the overwhelming majority of houseflies don't actually interact with humans, so it's only a few species of houseflies that you'll find in your home, and they have a huge variety of foods, or a huge variety in their diet. Robber flies are another family. These are a little more easily identifiable in the field because they just look so distinct from other flies. And these are really interesting because they have a very stout sort of proboscis here, and they feed exclusively on other insects. And the last family I sort of wanted to bring up are bee flies. These are really interesting because they look kind of like bees, but they aren't bees. Bees are not flies, and we're going to be talking about bees in a little bit. But these are true flies that try to mimic bees, and the adults do feed on nectar, whereas the larvae are what we call parasitoids. So these bee flies will go around laying their eggs in other insects, and those eggs then hatch and eat those insects alive. It's a really gruesome cycle, but that's what you hear when you hear the term parasitoid. That's what it's referring to. And they also have a lot of variation in their morphology among their subfamilies. All right. Any questions about true flies? Okay, awesome. Are the males pollinators then? No mosquitoes. Sorry. Yes, Diana. Males are pollinators. And so are females because they'll be drinking nectar up until they need to. Actually, sorry, that is not true because females do not need to. Yes, males are pollinators. And many flies are indeed really important pollinators. All right. Our next order that we're going to cover is Lepidoptera, and these are our butterflies and moths. Again, this is a lot of terminology, but we really just want to be focusing on the structure of the head. Butterflies and moths have this really, really, really long proboscis that they use to drink nectar and other fluids. And they also have these scaled wings. So here's a close-up of a butterfly's wing, and you'll notice that it's made up of all these little tiny scales that are used to reflect light, which is really neat. All right, so Lepidoptera is made up of butterflies and moths. All butterflies sort of belong to the superfamily Papilionoidea, and moths will make up the rest of the organisms in this order. They're super diverse, and the overwhelming majority of lepidopterans you'll find will be moths. So let's see if we can tell the difference between a butterfly and a moth. So true or false? Butterflies only fly during the day and moths only fly at night. False, 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 false. Okay, awesome. Yes, it is false. Butterflies you will typically find during the day, but moths you'll also find during the day. Here are two pictures of some awesome moths I found during the day this summer. All right, another one, true or false, moths are always furrier than butterflies. False, okay. True, true. Mostly, but not always. Okay, yes, I've written false, but Anne is a little more specific. It is mostly, but not always. Here's a common spring moth on the right, which doesn't look that furry, and a red admiral that kind of looks like it could be a little furry. So yes, but not always, and probably not a good feature to use to tell whether it's a butterfly or a moth. All right. True or false, butterflies are more colorful than moths. False, false, false. Okay, yes, this is false. There are so many amazing, colorful moths out there. Here's a beautiful wood nymph moth that I found a couple summers ago. It's a beautiful orange and white and black. It actually makes an excellent bird poo mimic when it has its wings folded up. Here's a lovely plume moth over here, which I guess is brown, but it's really interestingly shaped and very colorful in person, so moths can be very, very colorful. Okay, last one. True or false, all butterflies have clubbed antennae and moths do not have clubbed antennae. False, false, true, true, yes, mostly skippers. So this is almost entirely true. There are very few exceptions, but almost all butterflies have clubbed antennae. And so clubbed antennae are these really thin antennae with these knobs at the end, and butterflies typically have them, whereas moths will not. You'll notice that this moth does not. Well, you can barely see its antenna actually. But yeah, so these clubbed antennae are very characteristic of butterflies. And again, all butterflies fall under this one superfamily, whereas moths sort of make up everything else. Now, the reason I'm not covering families in this order is because butterflies and moths, at least the larger ones, are typically a lot easier to identify, even to species. And so there are quite a few resources out there that can help you identify butterflies and moths. They're very charismatic, and we'll be talking about those resources in a little bit. All right, so we're going to move on to our last order, and that's going to be bees and wasps. So these are under the order Hymenoptera, wasps, bees, ants, and sawflies. All hymenopterans, and again, that's a really big word, but it covers 4 really diverse groups. They all have 2 pairs of wings, as do most insects, but that's kind of how you tell them apart from flies, for example. And many of them have what you call a wasp waist. So you'll notice that the thorax kind of tapers here towards the abdomen. And that's also a defining characteristic that will separate it from flies, for example. Here we have a fly that belongs to the order Diptera that we were talking about earlier. And it's trying really hard to look like a bee or a wasp under Hymenoptera. But we can tell that it's not a bee or a wasp and is in fact a fly because firstly, it only has 1 pair of wings, and that's really obviously shown here. Secondly, it's not really showing that wasp waist that we'd expect to see. And thirdly, it has these huge compound eyes that are almost like a helmet on its head, which most bees and wasps you won't find. Carly, does that mean all ants have wings? Good question. So ants are, they've evolved from a lineage of wasps that have lost their wings. So ants are basically like wingless wasps, and they fall within their own family. So ants do not have wings, or at least worker ants do not have wings. All right, back to here, sorry, flies also typically have much shorter antennae very close to their heads, whereas you'll notice here that bees and wasps have really long antennae. In the bottom right corner, you'll notice that this wasp here kind of looks like it has 2 wings, and that's because wasps have their wings sort of attached by these Velcro-like structures. So when they hold their wings back like this, it only looks like they have 2 wings. So you might confuse them for a dipteran or a true fly. But again, they have this wasp waist that tells them apart. They have these long antennae, and they don't have these huge eyes. Now the eyes I'd be a little bit more careful with because there is a bit more variation in that. But typically dipterans that are trying to look like bees and wasps will have these huge eyes. All right, some more terminology that you might want to familiarize yourself with. First, again, here's that pronotum. We're familiar with this. We've talked about this a few times in bugs and beetles. It's this piece here between the head and the thorax, and it can sort of give you an idea of what family or subfamily this Hymenopteran might belong to based on its shape and size. Flies and wasps as well have what we call ocelli, which are these simple eyes. So all bees and wasps will look like they have 2 eyes, but they actually have 5. And there are just these simple eyes useful for seeing in the dark, and their shape as well as the placement on the head can give you an idea of what kind of bee or wasp it is. The antennae, again, are long, and they're distinctly segmented. So you'll notice that they have these segments or flagellomeres, and the number of segments can also give you an idea of what kind of insect it is. And finally, The abdomen, this is also composed of multiple segments, and the coloration on these segments can also give you an idea of how to ID them. Bees and wasps are among the easier insects to identify, at least the larger ones, especially compared to flies. Flies are just really, really difficult, but bees and wasps typically have more distinct coloration. Just some more body parts. This is just to give you an idea of what entomologists look for when they're identifying an insect. So again, we talked about wing venation. Here are all the sort of wing venation parts that they look for. So all these little cells and this basal vein, as well as parts on the head. So again, a lot of body parts to sort of look for. Just note the flagella. So again, this is the antenna, and the ocellus. So these little simple eyes. Those are what you want to go to first. Any questions about Hymenopteran anatomy? Okay. Awesome. So I'll move on. Here's a lovely cuckoo wasp, and it's one of my favorite wasps because it's so distinctly colored. And I just wanted to point out these lovely segments. It's really showing off those segments very well. And again, the number of segments will give you an idea of what kind of wasp it may be. Now, here's an insect that looks very similar to a wasp, but it isn't, and we can tell because it doesn't have that segmented antenna. So does anyone know or have an idea of what kind of insect this might be? Moth. Okay, yes, this is a moth that's trying to look like a wasp. It's called a hornet moth. And moths do have scaled wings, but this one somehow has managed to make its wings almost completely translucent. And yeah, it's a moth. It's got these little plumous antennae or furry antennae, comb-like, which is very distinct from a bee or a wasp. Alright, so we're going to talk about our first wasp family. So this is family Vespidae. And this is my personal favorite family. I'm very heavily biased towards vespid wasps. And they can be identified in a dichotomous key through the shape, again, of their pronotum and their wing venation and the segments on their feet. But they're really easy to spot. They're typically the larger ones, the chunkier ones, for lack of a better word, and you'll sort of notice what I'm talking about when I talk about the other families. And at rest, their wings are almost always sort of folded longitudinally over their body. And vespid wasps are really interesting because they exhibit, or many exhibit, what we call eusociality. So eusociality is among the highest levels of social behavior with an organized division of labor. So they're usually large family groupings in which most females are workers, and they're all led by one or multiple queens. And there will be varying levels of social hierarchies and eusociality depending on the type of vespid wasp it is. Paper wasps typically have like a weaker form of eusociality where there's still some sort of fighting among wasps and between wasps and queens, whereas your hornets and your yellow jackets, which are your other eusocial wasps, are a lot more strictly organized. And it's really, really interesting just looking at the evolution of eusociality in these insects. Does anyone have any questions about vespid wasps and eusociality? Okay, awesome. The next family of wasps I'd like to cover is Ichneumonidae. These are ichneumoniid wasps or ichneumon wasps. also known as Darwin wasps. Oh, yes, Michael, question? All right, while we wait for the question, I'll just continue here. These you'll be able to tell by their exceptionally long antenna, so typically 16 or more segments in their antenna. And females also have a very distinct ovipositor. So these wasps are not like our eusocial Vespid wasps here. They are almost entirely solitary. They can't sting humans. And why do wasps naturally use hexagons when constructing nests? Ooh, very good question. That's a very good question. I don't know. But I would love to know. That's a very good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. Huh. Neat. Yeah, they usually start in these hexagonal patterns, and then as the colony grows, they'll start to form this little paper covering over their nest until there's only a little entrance at the end. But I don't know why they start with hexagons. Might have something to do with space efficiency. Oh, yeah. That's neat. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Okay. I'm gonna actually look that up once we're done here. But heading back to these solitary wasps, these, like those flies again that we were talking about, are parasitoids. Ichneumonidae wasps in particular are typically parasitoids of caterpillars or sawfly larvae. So they stick this long ovipositor, which is basically like an egg-laying device, into a caterpillar or the larva of choice. It'll stick its eggs into it, and then those eggs hatch and eat those caterpillars inside out. And then they sort of form these cocoons similar to butterflies. They undergo metamorphosis, and then they emerge as adult wasps to repeat the cycle. Another way to tell apart ichneumonids from other wasps is that they have these really, really slender wasp waists. So here it's very pronounced. And it's a very thin sort of abdomen. Here's a male on the top right, and you won't see the ovipositor, but you can still tell it's an ichneumon based on its long antenna and that very slender abdomen. Any questions about ichneumon wasps or Darwin wasps? Oh, thank you, Anne. Hexagons are the most efficient packing shape. That's neat. That's really amazing. Okay, I'm gonna move on here, but that's pretty cool. All right, Chalcid wasps are also parasitoids, and they are the largest superfamily that contains 19 families of parasitoids. And most of these are very, very small, less than 3 millimeters, and some of the smallest Chalcid wasps are among the smallest animals that we know of, like just a little over a millimeter. And they are best identified by their wing venation. And again, when it gets to this size, they can start getting really a lot more difficult to identify. Here on the bottom left, this wasp on a flower, this is my attempt to take a picture of a Chalcid wasp through a hand lens, and even then, like, I just couldn't get it because it's so small. But yeah, these are really ecologically significant as parasitoids because all of these wasps are species specific, and or they'll only parasitize on one particular species of caterpillar or another kind of insect, or several different species of caterpillars or spiders. And that's what makes them really, really efficient forms of biocontrol. So if we take a look here, this kind of looks like a fly again, and again, it only seems to have 2 wings, but again, you can tell by these segmented antennae that it is in fact a wasp, and it is actually a Chalcid wasp. Chalcid wasps, as well as a few types of ichneumon wasps or ichneumoniid wasps, are used to kill the emerald ash borer. So Does anyone know what the emerald ash borer is, or could anyone tell us in the chat what the emerald ash borer is? A beetle that is devastating our natural ash tree populations. Awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So it is an invasive beetle to North America that is decimating our ash trees by eating out their xylem and phloem. And it's getting really hard to control. These wasps are the easiest and safest form of biocontrol currently because they're so species specific again. You know that if you raise them and release them, they're largely only going to be targeting emerald ash borers. The only problem is that you kind of have to keep sending them out again and again because you send out like a cycle of them and, they'll go out and they'll parasitize, but they don't spread very well. And so they'll do their thing and then they'll kind of die off within a few generations and then you have to send out more. But otherwise, they are a really interesting form of biocontrol that we've been looking into. Other wasps, just quickly, these are cuckoo wasps. I just wanted to bring these up because they're so pretty and green, and they're among my favorite wasps. And sphecoid wasps here are these little thread-waisted wasps. So we saw those Ichneumon or Darwin wasps a few slides ago, and they had really slender abdomens. These have like almost no abdomen in the beginning here. It's almost like a needle connected to the thorax, and that's why some of them are called thread-waisted wasps. And these are also solitary hunters, whereas cuckoo parasites, as their name would suggest, are brood parasites. So they'll go in and they'll lay their eggs around some other social insect, and those social insects will raise them as their own. All right, those are all the wasps within Hymenoptera. I just wanted to quickly go over bees as well. Does anyone know what the difference is, first of all, between bees and wasps? Okay. No? Okay. There really is no, bees produce honey, wasps don't. Okay, interesting distinction. Bees lose the stingers. Okay, very interesting distinction. So there is actually no real, there isn't like a huge, easily identifiable distinction between bees and wasps. Bees sort of evolved from wasps. The only difference is bees have these little comb-like structures on their front legs that they use to clean their antennae. And so yes, only honeybees make honey. So honeybees are a very specific species or group of species of bees that produce honey. There are also some wasps that produce honey, like Mexican honey wasps, which are a type of social paper wasp. And again, it's also only honeybees that lose the stingers. So if a honeybee stings you, it's very likely to lose its stinger. But there are some papers that have looked at yellow jackets as well, losing their stingers after stinging you, so we don't really know how good of a defining characteristic that is. None of these bees that we are seeing here will produce honey, but they all fall within this clade called Anthophila, and that's just the clade of bees. Everything else in Hymenoptera is going to be either a wasp or an ant or a sawfly. Some interesting bees I just wanted to talk about are these halictid bees. So sweat bees are like these pretty green bees. Going back to our chrysid bees, these are chrysid wasps or cuckoo wasps. These are kind of like a shimmery, sparkly green, whereas sweat bees are like a dull green. Mining bees are typically better identified just based on their nectar source in the field. If you wanted to pull out a dichotomous key, they're differentiated through these little gaps near the antenna, these little, what we call sutures, these little hole or dents near the antenna. And then these leaf-cutting bees, if you ever see a bee with like a really fuzzy abdomen or a really sort of thick abdomen, it's probably a leaf-cutting bee, and those abdomens are usually used to carry pollen. whereas mining bees, you'll find that they carry them in their mouth. And sweat bees, you'll notice, have like these big hind legs to carry pollen. This family of bees in particular has been studied the most and is the most charismatic because firstly it contains honeybees, but it also contains bumblebees and carpenter bees. And again, their hind legs are also enlarged and have what we call a pollen basket to carry pollen. Carpenter bees look very similar to bumblebees, except they have a completely hairless abdomen, whereas bumblebees have some hair on their abdomen, and bumblebees are just typically bigger and kind of fatter than honeybees. Does anyone have any questions about these bee or wasp families that we've covered so far? Do all bees have hair on their thorax? From my understanding, they all have different levels of hair on their thorax, so some may appear to have less hair, whereas some may appear to have more. Wasps will also have small amounts of hair on their thorax, so you'll notice these specid wasps have a little bit. This may appear completely hairless, but it'll have, a few hairs. Yeah, there's a little bit. Wasps are generally more hairless, and that's why they don't carry pollen as well, and that's why we don't consider them to be very good pollinators. But they do still pollinate just like bees. It is definitely the hair on bees that makes them easier or better pollinators, and they are more specialized to carry pollen because they eat pollen for their protein. What does a leafcutter bee use its leaves for? Is it food or is it creating shelter? It is creating shelter, so it is not going to eat leaves. Where did we go? Oh, there it is. Yep, they wrap their larvae in leaves, sort of. It's kind of used to create a little shelter for their larvae, which is really neat. All right. So, that's it for all of the orders that we've covered today. A quick story on why identification is important. You'll notice that we've been hearing about these murder hornets in the news lately, and just recently there was a destroyed hornet nest near the US-BC border that contained almost 200 queens, and each of these queens would have had their own chance to start their own nest. So it's important to know how to identify these insects from others, because Asian giant hornets look very similar to a lot of other insects. And if you're a member of any, Facebook insect identification group or on Reddit or on Twitter, you'll find that a lot more people are starting to kill some of these other insects and then post them like, oh, I saw this, what was probably, a pigeon tremix on the bottom left corner with a huge stinger, and oh, is it a murder hornet? And sometimes a lot of these sort of harmless insects get caught in the way when we're trying to focus on Asian giants. So that's why it's important to know your insects and explore entomology and learn more about the great diversity that we have in insects, because there really are just so many in wasps alone, but also in flies and beetles, in moths and butterflies and bugs. All right, so we're just going to quickly go over these 6 orders. Orthopterans, again with these enlarged hind legs. Beetles with their mandibles and their hardened forewings. True bugs with their little needle-like beak and these overlapping wings that are semi-membranous. True flies with their single pair of wings and large compound eyes. Butterflies with their scaled wings. And bees, wasps with their 2 pairs of membranous wings and their wasp waist. So let's do a quiz. What order do we think this insect belongs to? Oh, and good question, is a hornet a type of wasp? Yes, a hornet is a type of Vespid wasp. So hornets, again, are these social insects, so they form colonies and hives. And we talked about colonial wasps back here. Vespid wasps, so hornets are a type of wasp. Hornets and yellow jackets are the sister taxa that both fall within the family Vespidae. All right, back to our quiz here. What order does this insect belong to? Hemiptera? Yes, yep, so it's Hemiptera, and we can tell by this sort of needle-like beak that kind of looks really long. To be honest, that's because it's feeding from nectar from an oxeye daisy. But you can also see this triangle back here, and these clear membranous wings. And yep, if you are having difficulty with the Latin name, you're welcome to also enter the common name. We've gone through a lot of Latin names today. How about this one? What? Hymenoptera? Okay. Thread-waisted wasp? Okay. Hymenoptera. Wasp. Alright, so yeah, so this is a Hymenopteran. It is not a thread-waisted wasp, nor is it an Ichneumonidae. It's a family that we didn't actually cover, but for the purposes of this webinar, this is a Hymenopteran, and we can tell again by that wasp waist, and it has somewhat longer antenna compared to what you'd expect to find in a fly. You can also see this little ovipositor that's coming out of the end of the abdomen here, this little line. That's going to be used to stick its eggs probably into a poor insect. And again, just keeping in mind that these parasitoids typically don't sting humans, and they're all solitary compared to our vespid wasps. How about this one? Bee fly, true fly. Yep, so this is a true fly. It is not a bee fly, although that was pretty close. It is a fly that's trying to mimic a bee. These are called hover flies. They're also known as flower flies. You can tell it's a true fly again by the one pair of wings and that sort of huge eyes, barely visible antenna. But yes, these are flower flies or hover flies, which, like bee flies, will try to look like bees. All right, a bonus question. Which family does this insect belong to? We kind of covered them a little quickly, but yes, this is a robber fly. And again, it looks very distinct compared to other dipterans. It has this very obvious sort of hump here in its thorax and a long abdomen. And you can tell it's by its stout proboscis that it is a robber fly, and it will eat other insects. And yep, here we go, just an overview of that. Okay, it is 3:02. We are going to go over a few other... Oh, is the robber fly in its own family? Yes, it is. We are going to go over how to use the dichotomous key if you want to stick around for that. But in the meantime, if you have to get going, thank you for joining us. Just really quickly, we're going to go over how to use the dichotomous key. So this is Marshall's, which is a really good dichotomous key to use if you're living in sort of Eastern North America. You kind of need to be able to identify to order on your own, and then the guide will help you get to family. So we've covered a few orders, and we're going to now use this guide to figure out how to get to family. Okay, so here's an interesting insect on the right-hand side. The first question that we open up to when we open the dichotomous key in Marshall's is it one of these 5 distinctly shaped orders? So which order do we think this insect might belong to? Orthoptera. Okay, awesome. So yes, this is order Orthoptera, grasshoppers and crickets. They kind of like using common names here because Latin names can get a little overwhelming. But the reason we do typically use Latin names in entomology is because there are just so many insects out there, like the overwhelming majority of them don't even have common names. And so it's good to be able to familiarize yourself with these Latin names and get them out of the way first. All right, so we flip to the page on grasshoppers and crickets, and it tells you to kind of start here, where that little start here box on the left, and it sort of guides you in two directions. So are the front legs kind of slender, or are they short and broad for digging? What do we think about these front legs? Slender, short and slender? Yeah, they are kind of short, but they are more slender than they are broad. And sometimes taking a look at these pictures that they offer can help. So this is a mole cricket, and it has really, really broad, like thick front legs used for digging. So yes, this is going to be a slender-legged orthopteran. All right, let's move a little closer here. So now we take a look at the antenna and ovipositor. So we can't really see, or I guess we can see an ovipositor on this insect, but if, say you didn't know what an ovipositor was, thankfully what this dichotomous key does is it gives you a number of options for body parts. So here you can tell either using the antenna or the ovipositor. So in this case, is the antenna really, really long, or are the antenna kind of short? Long, okay, awesome, antennae are long, and then we kind of move on from here. The next one, we'll start talking about the tarsi, and those are a little difficult to see here because we don't have a microscope, but this one does have 4 segments on its tarsi. Just if you're interested, if you were to take a look under a microscope, you'd be able to count 4 segments, and then you just follow this dichotomous key all the way through. So here, you'll find that the body isn't strongly arched compared to this image over here where it's like really, really convex, very arched. And the wings are kind of present. You'll see some wings present over here. And again, if you took a look at the tarsi, you'd find that they're shaped in a certain way. So it is a lot of terminology that you have to know when you're opening up a dichotomous key. And that's why it's often helpful to sort of be able to familiarize yourself with common families before you open up a dichotomous key, which is sort of what we did today. Just for your interest, because we are a little over time, these are what we call bush katydids. They belong under this sort of subfamily here, and this dichotomous key will take you to the page where they then describe these subfamilies in a little bit more detail, so you can find our katydids down here, and it'll show you a bunch of pictures of what it may look like. You can't really identify a genus or species with this dichotomous key, and typically with dichotomous keys, unless it's very specific to the order that you're looking at, it won't really take you to genus or species because things get a lot more specific. Are there recommendations on how to see those smaller feet? Yeah, so Diana, excellent. Use a hand lens, and that's exactly what I use with a live animal. So having a hand lens or even like a magnifying glass can be really helpful. But usually if you do want to identify to genus or species, you're looking at really, really small features, especially with flies and wasps, and the really small Chalcid, those little parasitoid wasps we were talking about. And that's why sometimes there's really no alternative to identifying than just killing it, taking it back to the lab with you and sticking it under a microscope, because they can get really small. All right, so that's it for today's presentation. Here's some resources. Bug Guide is an awesome resource across North America that you can take a look at to assist with your insect ID. You can submit an ID request, so you can submit like a photo of your insect of interest, and it'll give you, the community and Bug Guide will help you sort of come to an ID. You can also check out the guide here, which sort of carries you through all these insect orders and other arachnids as well. So they cover spiders, they cover millipedes and centipedes, and crabs and other crustaceans as well. iNaturalist is like Bug Guide, but a little broader. So iNaturalist is this community-backed website where you can Yes, I love bug guide too. Sorry, iNaturalist, yeah, you can use it for insects and other organisms as well. So plants, I typically like using iNaturalist for, birds, small mammals. Ontario BioBlitz, if you're living in Ontario, you may find a regional BioBlitz near you where you can go out, and typically they have some insect identification programming. So the purpose of a BioBlitz is to go out and count as many species as you can and log them all into a database just to know what's in your area. So typically they have some insect programming where someone who really knows their insects will help you through identifying them, and you identify them together outside in real time, which is a lot better and perhaps much better hands-on experience than just reading through Bug Guide or attending a webinar. And the last one here is Bumblebee Watch. And, oh, thank you, Michael. Yes, it's Insects, Their Natural History and Diversity by Stephen Marshall, who is a professor at the University of Guelph, or a retired professor. Sorry, the last one here is Bumblebee Watch. So if you see a bumblebee, you can report your bumblebees here. A lot of bumblebees are under threat. There are some that are almost considered extirpated in Ontario, like the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee and the rusty patch bumblebee that scientists are really desperate to find. And so if you see a bumblebee, take a picture, submit it to Bumblebee Watch. And you can also look at different bumblebee species in your area using this website as well. All right. You can connect with us. We do have tutorials on how to use bugguide.net and iNaturalist. Eric, will there be future BioBlitz events? Yes, absolutely. Right now, during the pandemic, everything is on hold. If you go to ontarioBioBlitz.ca, it will sort of say that everything is TBD, but if there ever has been a BioBlitz near your location, they also have a database available, so you can go on there and check out what kinds of organisms have been listed in those areas, if that helps. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'll be here for more questions. And sorry, what is a BioBlitz? Yep, so a BioBlitz is a regional event where you go out to, say, a local natural reserve or a conservation area, and you just catalog every single organism that's there. So there will be different programs on insects and reptiles, birds, plants, and different outings sort of to the same area where you go out and, okay, so all these plant people at this time will go out and catalog all the plants they can find in this area, in this conservation area or a reserve. And then insects, at maybe 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. will go out and catalog all the insects, etc. If that helps. All right. I will still be here to take more questions. Excluding the invasives, are all the insects here found in Ontario, Canada? Yes, all the insects we talked about are found in Ontario, Canada, excluding the Asian giant hornets.